In every city, especially one as historically rooted as Aethelburg, there's a figure of authority whose presence is a source of unwavering assurance, someone whose integrity is beyond reproach. But what happens when that faith is fatally misguided? What is the outcome when the one tasked to safeguard the innocent becomes the architect of their ruin? In this old, familiar locale, nothing outwardly suggested trouble. Children chased balls in the cobblestone squares, residents offered their customary greetings, and the slow, dignified rhythm of life persisted. Yet, underneath this facade of normalcy, a terrible truth was unspooling, destined to send a seismic shock through the populace. What action do you take when the person everyone reveres, the one pledged to uphold the law, is hiding something unspeakable? At first glance, everything was in its proper place. He was Chief Inspector Alistair Finch, a devoted husband and father. She was Lydia Vance, a brilliant young woman on the cusp of a promising future. Their paths intertwined as is common in a tight-knit community, but somewhere along the way, the dynamic shifted. Polite, brief exchanges became lengthier. Private conversations that started innocently spiraled into something deeply inappropriate. Before either truly grasped it, an insurmountable boundary had been crossed, one that could never be untransgressed. How does a society reconcile with the horrifying realization that the individual they trusted above all others is capable of the unthinkable? Some argue that every monstrous act leaves a trace, regardless of how expertly it's concealed. But what if the person directing the investigation is the very one who knows precisely where that trail ends? Chief Inspector Alistair Finch was more than a figure in a uniform. He was the bedrock of Aethelburg. Neighbors relied on him, colleagues respected him, and his family adored him. To most, Alistair was a man who skillfully balanced the intense pressures of police work with the duties of being a husband and father. Married to Eleanor with 2 daughters, he lived the quintessential, admired life, seemingly effortlessly managing his career and home. His younger daughter, Seraphina, idolized him. To Seraphina, her father wasn't just the chief inspector, he was her unshakable hero, the anchor of their lives. Alistair's older daughter had a dearest friend, Lydia Vance. Lydia had practically grown up in the Finch home. She and Seraphina were inseparable, the type of friends who walked right in without knocking. Lydia was practically family. Their bond stretched back through all their memory, from building blanket forts as toddlers to late-night revision sessions in school. Where Seraphina was, Lydia was almost always nearby. But Lydia wasn't just Seraphina's best friend. She was the daughter of Sergeant Marcus Vance, a subordinate who had worked under Alistair for years. Marcus and Alistair shared a connection that went beyond professional duty. They were true friends. They had celebrated milestones together, attended family events, and supported each other through thick and thin. Lydia's presence in Alistair's life was as reliable as the setting sun, something that never required a second thought. She was simply, consistently, there. The kinship between these two families was forged over years, cemented by mutual respect and shared experiences. Alistair could vividly recall the day Lydia was born, holding her tiny, swaddled form and promising Marcus he would always look out for her. Their lives naturally intertwined. Summer barbecues where Lydia sat laughing on Alistair's shoulders, holiday breaks where the Vance and Finch families shared genuine moments of joy, and Christmas mornings spent exchanging gifts. Lydia was part of every major event, birthdays, ceremonial occasions, and quiet Sunday afternoons in the Finch living room. Her tie to Alistair was deep, unquestioned. To Lydia, Alistair was Seraphina's father, a powerful second father figure in her life, someone she could wholeheartedly trust. She never once hesitated to be in his company, whether at his home, at family parties, or dropping by the station to meet her own father. But now, Lydia was 18, no longer the little girl Alistair had once bounced on his knee. She was transitioning into adulthood, nurturing big dreams of joining an elite security establishment, perhaps the MI5 or the National Crime Agency. She possessed a fierce ambition that crackled with energy, a clear sense of purpose. Their lives, once connected purely through friendship and family, were now approaching a perilous juncture neither of them foresaw. Alistair found himself seeing her more often, not just as Seraphina's sidekick, but as someone whose path crossed his regularly. She was in his home most weekends, they attended school and family functions together, and occasionally Lydia would swing by the chief inspector's office to find her father, waiting in the anteroom or strolling through the corridors. She was perpetually near, a constant fixture in the periphery of Alistair's life. And with the passage of each day, their connection grew just a little more complex. It began like any ordinary workday, one that should have dissolved into the predictable routine of life. But some moments possess the inherent power to irrevocably alter everything, and this was one of them. Lydia Vance hadn't intended to linger at the police headquarters. She had only stopped by to see her father, Sergeant Marcus Vance, hoping for a quick greeting and a ride home. It was a gesture she had repeated countless times, waiting in the familiar hallways filled with the murmur of conversations and the occasional ringing phone. It was mundane, predictable. But on this specific afternoon, the atmosphere felt charged. Alistair Finch caught sight of her from his office window as she entered the station, her arrival capturing his attention in a way it never had before. She was no longer the adolescent girl he recalled. The gaucheness of youth had given way to the undeniable form of a young woman. There was a composed elegance to her movements now, a quiet self-assurance that was new. Alistair rationalized it. It was just an observation, nothing more. But the thought remained, more persistent than it should have. He knew Lydia well, too well. He had watched her mature, laughed at her childhood mischief, and celebrated her successes alongside his daughter Serafina. But today, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, something was stoked within him, a change he fiercely resisted acknowledging. He tried to dismiss it, tried to remind himself of her identity and his own, but the longer he watched her, the more difficult it became to turn away. She wasn't simply Lydia, the little girl from the garden parties. She was someone else now, someone he found himself noticing in inappropriate ways. The realization rattled him, like a sudden stumble on familiar territory. Guilt gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, whispering that this was wrong, that he had to stop. But temptation is insidious. It finds a way to infiltrate the defenses of even the most disciplined mind. And as hard as he fought to expel it, it held on, unwelcome and tenacious. When Lydia started toward her father's desk, Alistair stepped out of his office, almost on instinct. He knew Marcus was out on assignment. He had dispatched him earlier himself. There was no one else for Lydia to meet, no one for her to wait with. And in that solitary moment, Alistair perceived an opening, a means to prolong this encounter, to examine a curiosity he dared not name. "Lydia," he called, his voice easy, almost paternal. "Your dad won't be back for a bit. Why don't you come wait in my office?" There was nothing in his tone to hint at anything improper. No reason for Lydia to feel any alarm. She smiled readily, trusting him implicitly. He was, after all, her father's dearest friend, a figure she had known her entire life. She followed him without hesitation, entering the office she had seen countless times. Alistair gestured to a chair by the window, watching her as she settled. She looked around the room, her gaze resting on the photographs and police memorabilia on the shelves, mementos from years in law enforcement, framed citations, and keepsakes from retired cases. The room, much like the man himself, seemed imbued with authority and experience. Lydia admired it all with a touch of awe, utterly oblivious to the dark thoughts taking root in Alistair's mind. He forced himself to act normally, to remember this was just a casual chat, just another afternoon. But as he sat opposite her, something deep within him refused to be silenced. She wasn't just a visitor, she was a young woman within arm's reach, someone who, for the first time in years, made him feel something unexpected. He inquired about her academic life, a safe, familiar topic. Lydia, comfortable in his presence, answered with enthusiasm. She spoke of her courses, her friends, and the ambitious future she envisioned for herself. "I've been seriously considering a career in national security," she said, her voice bright with aspiration. "Maybe high-level intelligence, or even the MI5. Something impactful." Alistair listened, his full attention on her. There was a sincerity in her words, a spark of ambition that reminded him of his own youth. And in that instant, he saw an opportunity, a chance to offer guidance, to subtly position himself as someone who could shape her trajectory. The idea surfaced unbidden, a path to extend their conversations beyond this office, ensuring these moments didn't simply end here. "You know," Alistair said slowly, leaning forward, "I have colleagues in those very agencies. I could put in a strong recommendation for you, maybe even help you get some real-world exposure." Lydia's face illuminated at the offer. "Really? You'd do that?" He offered a mentor's smile, playing the role she expected. "Of course. But there's a great deal to master before you reach that level. It's a demanding path, and you'll need to commit fully. If you're serious, I could help you prepare." Nothing in his tone suggested anything other than genuine benevolence. Lydia, eager to succeed, accepted the offer without a second thought. Why would she question his motives? To her, this was simply an experienced, powerful man offering invaluable guidance, someone she trusted implicitly. Alistair leaned back in his chair, a quiet satisfaction washing over him at how smoothly the conversation had unfolded, how effortlessly he had sown the seeds for future meetings. He told himself it was harmless, that he was merely helping a driven young woman achieve her goals. But deep down, he knew better. He knew that every word spoken, every promise made, was the beginning of something far more sinister. As Lydia sat across from him, radiating excitement about the opportunities ahead, Alistair permitted himself a moment to bask in the power he wielded, the power to sculpt her aspirations, to direct her path, and, if he chose, to take these meetings further than she could possibly imagine. And in that instant, a point of no return had been silently, irrevocably crossed. Opportunities can feel like lifelines, especially when extended by someone you implicitly trust. For Lydia, Alistair's offer of mentorship felt like the single greatest stride toward her future, a rare chance to gain an advantage in a competitive field, guided by someone with influence and connections. But what she couldn't perceive, what no one could, was how easily a dream can be fashioned into a trap when managed by the wrong person. Alistair's proposition was simple, a series of private, focused sessions, just the two of them, aimed at preparing Lydia for the rigors of national security. He framed it as exclusive career counsel, a way to provide her with the crucial edge needed to triumph. Initially, Lydia felt only profound gratitude. After all, how many young people her age received such personalized attention from someone in his position? He assured her that his instruction would distinguish her from her peers, unlocking doors she hadn't even begun to consider. Yet, Alistair was meticulously cautious. With every piece of advice, every recommendation, he subtly planted seeds of doubt in Lydia's mind. He warned her not to mention their sessions to many people, claiming others wouldn't understand her ambition. "People might try to hold you back," he cautioned. "They might tell you it's unrealistic, that you're aiming too high. The fewer people who know, the better. It's safer that way." At first, this logic resonated with Lydia. She had heard skeptical remarks from others before, suggestions that young women, especially women like her, should temper their expectations. Alistair's warning felt protective, even wise. She didn't question it. Why would she? He was only looking out for her, or so she was convinced. The private sessions began innocently, discussions on the challenges of law enforcement, the necessity of resilience, and the skills needed to thrive in high-stakes environments. They met after school hours, initially in Alistair's office, and then later in more isolated settings under the pretext of intense training. He consistently made her feel exceptional, as if she were receiving something no one else could access. Lydia, desperate to prove her worth, threw herself into the sessions, convinced they were defining her future. But slowly, the meetings began to morph. What started as professional guidance became more personal, more intimate. Alistair began asking about her life outside of school, her deepest anxieties, her aspirations, her relationships. He deliberately erased the boundary between mentor and confidant, weaving himself deeper into her life without her awareness. He was patient, calculating. He never rushed the process. He allowed Lydia to come to him, to trust him completely. Every time she confided in him, every time she sought his counsel, his grip on her life subtly tightened. And Lydia, caught in the spotlight of his powerful attention, never recognized it for what it was. She believed she was being guided, not groomed. She believed Alistair was lifting her up, not dragging her down. The sessions began to extend, often late into the evenings. Alistair always had a convincing rationale to prolong them, a crucial topic they hadn't covered, a vital piece of advice that couldn't wait. Soon, they were meeting late into the night, the gatherings framed as essential, necessary steps on her journey to success. "If you want to make it," he told her, his gaze intense, "you must be willing to put in the extra effort." Lydia, fueled by ambition and the desire to please him, agreed without reservation. She told herself these late hours were part of her development, that the inconvenience was a small price for everything Alistair was offering. Yet, with each session, she found herself more attached to him, not just as a mentor, but as someone she relied on profoundly, someone she depended on in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Alistair knew precisely what he was doing. He chose his words meticulously, making her believe their time together was both a privilege and a secret, something they had to protect from others who might misunderstand. "Some people won't see this for what it truly is," he warned her. "They'll think it's inappropriate. They'll try to come between us, tell you to quit, make you abandon your dream. But I know how far you can go, Lydia. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Lydia believed him. Why wouldn't she? He was the chief inspector, her father's trusted friend, the man who had known her entire life. If he insisted their meetings were necessary, they were. If he said the secrecy was for her benefit, she trusted him. And so, she remained silent, telling no one, not her father, not Serafina, not her closest friends, about the time she spent with Alistair. The late-night sessions swiftly became their own isolated reality, a space where Lydia felt both vulnerable and powerful. Alistair made her feel like she was evolving into someone important, someone capable of magnificent things. The more time they shared, the more she came to rely on him, not just for career guidance, but for emotional validation. She saw him as a protector, someone who understood her in ways no one else did. But Alistair's mentorship was never about her future, it was about his own selfish desire. He strategically ensured she needed him, not just for her career, but for her very sense of self-worth. With every passing week, Lydia was more drawn to him, more dependent on his approval. She wasn't just learning from him, she was falling under his spell. Then, one evening, the dynamic fractured completely. They were reviewing old case summaries, discussing real-world examples of high-pressure decision-making, when Alistair's hand rested on her shoulder for a moment too long. Lydia didn't flinch. She didn't feel she should. It seemed like a natural extension of the closeness they had forged, an expected part of their bond. Alistair, sensing her passive acceptance, took it as permission to advance. The first kiss was unannounced, but it didn't feel forceful. It felt preordained, like a step they had been moving toward all along. Lydia, captured by the moment, didn't question it. She had become accustomed to following Alistair's lead, trusting his direction. If this was part of their connection, then she welcomed it. That night, the bridge between mentor and lover vanished entirely. What followed was no longer mentorship. It was a full-blown affair, concealed behind the same shield of secrecy Alistair had so meticulously constructed. Their meetings continued, now infused with a new intensity, a volatile mix of passion and control that left Lydia feeling both thrilled and trapped. She was falling deeper, convinced that what they shared was authentic, profound. To Lydia, Alistair was no longer just a mentor. He was her absolute guide, her protector, her everything. But Alistair's command over Lydia was not merely emotional. It was absolute. He had interwoven himself into every aspect of her existence, and with each passing day, she depended on him more, trusted him more, and believed that their relationship was something precious worth safeguarding. As their affair deepened, the walls around them contracted, locking Lydia into a world she didn't realize was built entirely on manipulation and deceit. There was no turning back. Alistair had her precisely where he wanted, utterly under his control and hopelessly in love. Secrets have a profound way of changing people, of quietly invading the small spaces of life and subtly knocking everything out of alignment. At first, the alterations are minor, almost unnoticeable. But as time drags on, the burden of those hidden truths begins to become apparent. For Lydia, the affair with Alistair had become the magnetic center of her universe. Where she had once been bubbly, transparent, and connected to her loved ones, she now began to withdraw, slowly but surely. The Lydia everyone knew was receding into the shadows. Calls from friends went unanswered, gatherings with Serafina became infrequent, and conversations with her father, Marcus, grew clipped and short. Where she once shared everything, her small daily triumphs, her frustrations, now she offered him little more than one-word responses and strained excuses. Marcus could feel the chasm widening, though he couldn't pinpoint the exact cause. He had always shared an enviable bond with Lydia, but now every effort to connect seemed to be met with a wall. She was perpetually busy, exhausted, or distracted. He tried to brush it off initially. Teenagers go through phases, he told himself. Maybe it's the pressure of school and future planning. But the longer it continued, the harder it became to ignore. There was a shift in her presence, something out of character. The Lydia he knew didn't keep secrets from him, but now she seemed to be carrying a massive, heavy burden, one she was unwilling to share. Marcus wasn't the kind to let things fade away. One evening, he seized the chance to confront her. She had arrived home late, her expression remote, as if her mind were miles away. He waited until she was setting down her things in the kitchen before stepping in. "Lydia," he said, keeping his voice carefully level. "We need to talk." Lydia looked up, a quick flash of guilt crossing her face before she masked it with a practiced smile. "What's wrong, Dad?" she asked, her voice casual, but Marcus could detect the underlying tension. "I've noticed you've been absent lately," Marcus continued gently. "You're not around as much, you're not talking to me like you used to. What is truly going on?" For a second, Lydia looked startled, as if she hadn't expected him to notice. But then she smiled again, this time more forced. "It's nothing, Dad. Just school. You know, a lot of work." Marcus was far from convinced. Something felt fundamentally wrong, and no matter how convincingly she acted, he could sense the distance growing between them. He pushed her softly, asking if anything was troubling her, anything she needed to discuss. But Lydia was prepared. She had been taught by Alistair how to evade, how to deflect, how to steer conversation away from the perilous territory without arousing suspicion. "I'm honestly fine," she insisted, her voice just a little too bright. "Seriously, Dad, you don't need to worry about me." Marcus wanted desperately to believe her, wanted to accept her assurances at face value, but a persistent knot of unease had settled in his stomach, one he couldn't shake. Meanwhile, Alistair was expertly managing the changes in his own life. Eleanor, his wife, had begun to sense a fundamental difference. After years of marriage, she knew Alistair better than anyone, and recently, there were small details that didn't align. He had always been a man of predictable, reliable routine, but now there were moments when he seemed distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere. He came home later than normal, offering ambiguous excuses about demanding shifts or sudden meetings. And when he was home, there was an agitation about him, an anxiety Eleanor hadn't witnessed before. She asked him about it, of course, small, subtle inquiries, careful not to sound accusing. "Is everything all right at the station?" she might ask over dinner. "You seem a bit preoccupied lately. Is something worrying you?" Alistair was ready for the questions. He knew how to lie without obvious hesitation, how to offer just enough believable detail to satisfy her without revealing anything concrete. "It's simply work," he would say, his tone light but not dismissive. "You know how it gets this time of year." Eleanor, though still troubled, would let it go, at least for a while. But the nagging feeling persisted. She noticed the small habits, how often he checked his phone, how unusually vague he was about his whereabouts. There were nights he came to bed long after she was asleep, and mornings when he left the house earlier than usual, always with a plausible excuse at the ready. Eleanor tried to tell herself she was overthinking it. Alistair was the chief inspector. His job inherently involved stress and responsibility. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about work. Something had changed. She just couldn't figure out what. The tension in the Finch household was initially faint, barely perceptible, but it magnified with each passing day, like a small shard buried beneath the skin, too small to draw immediate attention, but impossible to forget. Alistair, however, was meticulous, careful never to let the cracks widen too much, careful to keep the walls of his double life fully intact. He knew the right things to say, how to offer just enough affection to ward off suspicion. To Eleanor, he was still the husband she married, just a bit more tired, a little more preoccupied. To his daughters, he was still their father, just a bit more reserved than normal. But Alistair knew the horrific truth. He knew the walls were closing in, slowly but inexorably, and no matter how meticulously he managed the situation, the burden of his secret was beginning to exact its price. Lydia was also feeling the stress. She yearned for the simplicity of her old life, missed the effortless conversations with her father, missed the genuine, carefree laughter she used to share with Serafina. But every time she considered stepping away, every time she thought of pulling back from Alistair, she felt the invisible constraints tighten around her. He had become more than just a mentor, more than just a lover. He had become the center of her reality. And even as she felt the distance growing between herself and the people she cherished, she told herself it was worth the sacrifice. Alistair had promised her a future, had convinced her that what they shared was unique. She couldn't abandon it now, not after coming so far. And so, the distance deepened, between Lydia and her father, between Alistair and his wife, between who they were and who they had become. The cracks were small, but they were there, waiting, widening, threatening to shatter everything the moment the truth came to light. Secrets have a nasty habit of unraveling at the absolute worst possible moment. What begins quietly, hidden in the corners of stolen time, can rapidly grow into something that demands to be exposed, regardless of how meticulously it's concealed. For Alistair and Lydia, the moment they dreaded, the moment they believed would never arrive, was finally upon them. Lydia had known something was wrong for a couple of weeks. Initially, she dismissed it, convincing herself that stress or lack of sleep was to blame. But as the days passed, the signs became impossible to ignore. The morning nausea, the overwhelming fatigue, the profound, consuming feeling that something fundamental had changed inside her. Eventually, she purchased a pregnancy test, hoping, praying, that her fears were simply imagination. But when the two distinct lines appeared, confirming her worst nightmare, the world beneath her feet seemed to dissolve. She stared at the result in stunned silence, her heart hammering as 1,000 catastrophic thoughts flooded her mind. She was utterly unprepared for this. This wasn't part of the plan. And yet, there it was. The undeniable proof that life, in all its brutal unpredictability, had taken a turn she had never anticipated. She sat for what felt like endless hours, the weight of the realization pressing down hard on her chest. In that oppressive silence, only one thought remained perfectly clear. She had to tell Alistair. He had promised to be there for her, to help her build a future. If anyone could help her navigate this impossible situation, it would be him, wouldn't it? When Lydia finally mustered the courage to tell him, it was during one of their late-night meetings. They were seated close together, the air between them thick with the usual blend of tension and intimacy. She knew that the moment she spoke the words, everything would change. There would be no returning. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I need to tell you something." He glanced at her, instantly sensing the gravity in her tone. "What is it?" he asked, leaning in slightly, as if bracing himself for impact. Lydia hesitated, her hands trembling subtly, and then she spoke, the words spilling out before she could reconsider. "I'm pregnant." For a paralyzing moment, time seemed to stop. Alistair stared at her, his expression frozen in absolute disbelief. The words hung in the silence like a ticking bomb, each second stretching into an eternity. Panic slammed into him like a physical blow. His mind raced through the terrible implications. What this would mean for his career, his family, his hard-won reputation. Everything he had labored for, everything he had built, was now dangling by a single thread. If anyone discovered the truth, his wife, his daughters, the city council, the department, his life would be over. Alistair felt the walls violently closing in, the crushing weight of his double life suffocating him. He needed an immediate solution, something fast, something final. This couldn't be revealed. It wouldn't be revealed. "We can't do this," he said, his voice sharp, almost hysterical. This simply cannot happen. No one can. Lydia stared at him, hurt and confusion clouding her face. What do you mean? We can figure this out. You promised you would always be there for me. Alistair ran a shaking hand through his hair, his mind in a dizzying spin. He couldn't afford this scandal. He couldn't afford the ruinous fallout. In his terror, a solitary thought emerged. There was still time to fix this. There was still time to make it vanish. He leaned in, his voice low and urgent. You need to get rid of it, Lydia. We have to end this before it's too late. Lydia's heart plummeted at his words, an icy wave of disbelief washing over her. She had come to him for comfort, for support, but instead, she was met with cold rejection and raw fear. You're asking me to have an abortion, she whispered, her voice cracking. Alistair nodded, desperation etched across his face. It's the only way, he insisted. If anyone finds out, my wife, your father, everything will be ruined. We can't allow that to happen. Please, Lydia, you have to do this. But Lydia shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. No, she said firmly. I won't do that. This is our child, Alistair. You told me we were in this together. You promised. For the first time, Alistair truly grasped that Lydia believed the intricate fantasy he had woven around her, that their relationship was real, that they shared a future. And in that awful moment, he saw the full, devastating extent of his manipulation. She wasn't just carrying his child, she was carrying the full weight of every lie and promise he had fed her to keep her close. Alistair's panic intensified. He tried to reason with her, to make her comprehend the danger they were in. You don't understand, he pleaded. If this gets out, my career is finished. My family, my life. It will all be destroyed. We can't let that happen, Lydia. You have to end it. But Lydia was now resolute. She shook her head again, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I won't do it, she said softly, but with utter finality. I'm keeping it. This is my child, and I won't let you make me feel ashamed for wanting to keep it. Alistair felt the solid ground slipping from beneath him, his total control over the situation unraveling with every word she spoke. He had built his entire existence on maintaining control over his job, his family, his relationships. And now, in the face of Lydia's quiet defiance, that control was dissolving like sand through his fingers. For the first time in his life, Alistair Finch, the man everyone saw as composed, steady, and fully in control, felt powerless. And that terrified him more than anything. He tried one last time, his voice shattering under the immense weight of his desperation. Please, Lydia, he whispered. If you care about me, if you care about what we have, you'll do this. You'll end it before it's too late. But Lydia's resolve held fast. She looked him straight in the eye, her voice unwavering. No, she said simply. I'm keeping it. And in that moment, Alistair knew that the meticulously constructed life he had fought so hard to protect was on the precipice of total collapse. There was no going back. The truth was out, and no matter how desperately Alistair tried to control the narrative, the brutal consequences of his choices were closing in. The question was no longer if the truth would surface, but how much destruction it would leave in its wake. There is a moment when fear becomes all-consuming, when morality crumbles, logic fades, and all that remains is the primal instinct for self-preservation, regardless of the cost. For Alistair Finch, that terrifying moment had arrived. With every day that passed, the walls of his carefully curated life were contracting, and the truth of the pregnancy loomed like a colossal shadow, poised to swallow him whole. The baby was a threat Alistair could not evade. No amount of cajoling or lying had worked. Lydia had made her decision clear. She would not terminate the pregnancy. With that single decision, Alistair's world was irrevocably shattered. His career, his marriage, his reputation, everything was now on the brink. If the truth came out, there would be no recovery, no fixing the wreckage. Scandal, disgrace, ruin. His name would be utterly destroyed, the police department would be decimated by public fury, his wife Eleanor would leave, his daughters would disown him, and the city that once lauded him would turn against him with a vengeance. He saw no escape, no way to contain the damage. But then, a thought slithered into his mind, a thought that should have horrified him, yet brought a twisted sense of clarity. There was one path, one final, desperate measure, to ensure the truth never saw the light of day. He convinced himself it was the sole solution, the only way to protect everything he had worked for. He knew it was monstrous, knew that crossing this line was a point of no return, but in his mind, the choice was no longer between right and wrong. It was between survival and annihilation. The plan slowly took form, shaping itself in the dark corners of his consciousness. If Lydia was gone, if she simply vanished, no one would ever know. There would be inquiries, of course, but questions could be managed. He was the chief inspector, after all. He was an expert at controlling investigations, at steering them away from inconvenient facts. He could make it look like she had left willingly. He could ensure no one ever connected the horrifying dots. Alistair waited until the timing was perfect. He contacted Lydia, his voice calm and falsely reassuring, and invited her to dinner at an isolated location, just the two of them. He framed it as a chance to calmly discuss the future, to make arrangements for the baby, to figure out how they could move forward together. Lydia, despite everything, still believed in him. She wanted to believe they could somehow make it work, that Alistair would honor his promise to stand by her. She arrived at the location, a small, dilapidated hunting cottage in the New Forest region, far from prying eyes. Alistair greeted her with the same familiar smile, the same calming presence that had initially drawn her in. He had meticulously prepared everything, a quiet meal, wine poured into delicate glasses, a warm fire crackling on the hearth. They talked over dinner, their conversation saturated with false reassurances and promises. Alistair told her everything she wanted to hear, that they would figure it out, that they could still have a life together, that everything would ultimately be fine. And for a fleeting moment, Lydia allowed herself to believe him. She lowered her guard, feeling the familiar pull of the man she thought she knew. But Alistair's mind was elsewhere, focused intensely on the small vial hidden in his pocket. A vial containing the compound that would guarantee Lydia never spoke a word to anyone. He waited patiently for the precise moment. Lydia was focused on the conversation, unaware of Alistair's surging internal tension. As she absent-mindedly picked at her food, Alistair reached out casually for her glass. "Let me top that off for you," he offered with an easy grin, lifting the wine bottle before she could react. She was lost in her own positive thoughts of having a baby with the chief inspector. With practiced ease, he poured the wine, keeping his other hand steady as he palmed the vial. As the rich, red liquid flowed into the glass, he tilted the bottle just enough, allowing the vial's contents to slip into the wine, undetected. No stirring, no swirling. It dissolved seamlessly with the pour, utterly hidden within the dark liquid. He handed the glass back without missing a beat, his voice smooth and conversational. "This should help us relax a little," he said with a wink, watching as Lydia, trusting and completely oblivious, took a sip, then another. It didn't take long for the substance to take hold. Lydia's eyelids grew heavy, her words beginning to slur as she struggled to keep up with the conversation. A wave of confusion washed over her, and she looked at Alistair with a slight frown, as if trying to make sense of the sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. "I don't feel so well," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Alistair reached out, his hand resting on hers in a gesture of fake comfort. "It's all right," he said softly. "You just need to rest. Everything is going to be fine." Lydia's body went limp, her head lolling to the side as the drug pulled her into oblivion. Alistair watched her for a moment, ensuring the drug had done its job, and then, with chilling, automatic precision, he moved to the next phase of his plan. He carried her to his official vehicle, her unconscious form cradled in his arms, a dark echo of the day he had carried her as a baby. But this time, there was no affection, no pride, only cold, terrible resolve. Alistair drove in suffocating silence, the winding forest road stretching before him like a pathway to freedom. He had selected the spot with extreme care, a remote woodland clearing deep in the woods, far from any path or road. It was a place no one would ever stumble upon accidentally, a place where secrets could remain entombed. The drive was long, the crushing weight of his impending action pressing down on him with every mile. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The moment he had crossed the line, there was no choice but to see it through. When he reached the clearing, he stepped out of the car and scanned the surroundings, confirming they were completely alone. The forest was silent, the ancient trees standing like silent, indifferent witnesses to the impending crime. Alistair opened the car door and lifted Lydia from the passenger seat, her body still unresponsive. He carried her deep into the woods, the only sound the crunch of pine needles beneath his boots. And then, in that remote, forgotten spot, he did what he had convinced himself was necessary. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling only slightly as he placed them over her mouth and nose. Lydia stirred briefly, her body reacting instinctively, but the drug had too strong a hold. Within moments, the struggle ceased, and the forest fell silent once more. Alistair sat there for a moment, his hands still pressed against her lifeless face, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Then, as if controlled by an external force, he began to dig. He worked quickly, the wet, cold dirt flying beneath his hands as he created a shallow grave. Time blurred, the full, awful weight of his actions settling like a stone in his chest. But he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop, not now. When the grave was complete, he gently laid Lydia's body inside, covering her with the cold, damp earth. And just like that, she was gone, buried beneath the weight of betrayal and lies. Alistair stood over the grave, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. The night was still, the forest holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. But there was nothing left to do. He had made his choice, and now there was only silence. Without a word, Alistair turned and made his way back to the vehicle, leaving no visible trace of what had transpired. The new forest would keep his secret, and with it, the life he had been so desperate to protect. But some secrets simply refuse to stay buried. When a person vanishes in a close-knit city, it sends waves of shock through every segment of the community. People come together, neighbors exchange worried glances, and families desperately cling to one another, praying it never happens to them. But this time, the missing person wasn't just anyone. It was Lydia Vance, the daughter of a respected sergeant, a girl everyone knew and loved. The day Lydia failed to return home, panic began to spread. Her parents, Marcus and Victoria Vance, quickly moved from thinking she was just delayed to realizing something was catastrophically wrong. They tried her phone, but there was no response. They called her friends, but none had seen her. And when the hours stretched on with no sign of Lydia, a cold, crushing fear set in. Marcus knew in his gut something was amiss. A father's instinct was screaming. Lydia was not the kind of person to disappear without a word, without alerting someone. As the sun set on that first dreadful day, Marcus did the only thing he could. He filed a missing persons report. The Aethelburg Police Department sprang into action, or, at least, it appeared that way. Leading the search was none other than Chief Inspector Alistair Finch, the very man who had every reason to ensure Lydia was never located. Alistair wore the mask of the professional perfectly, his voice steady, his composure unerringly calm, as he vowed to the community he would do everything in his power to bring Lydia home. But every move Alistair made, every lead he followed, every search he organized, was done with a single objective: to keep the truth buried alongside Lydia. The search commenced immediately, with constables canvassing the city, questioning potential witnesses, and scouring known locations. Alistair ensured every effort looked entirely genuine, with teams searching public parks, abandoned warehouses, and back alleys. He was present at every stage, issuing orders, offering comfort to volunteers, and appearing to go above and beyond. To everyone else, he looked like a determined officer intent on finding the missing girl. In reality, Alistair was always 2 steps ahead, expertly guiding the investigation away from the one place they would never think to look: the isolated spot where Lydia's body lay hidden beneath the cold earth. Marcus, desperate for answers, leaned heavily on Alistair, his longtime friend and superior. Alistair played the part flawlessly, offering profound words of support and comfort, his arm often slung around Marcus's shoulders as they reviewed possible scenarios. "We'll find her, Marcus," he said repeatedly, his voice steady and reassuring. "I promise you, we'll bring her home." Each time Marcus's hope flickered, Alistair was there to intercept his doubt. He remained close to the family, visiting their home often, sitting at their kitchen table, and gently holding Victoria's hand as she wept. He became their lifeline in the chaos, the one person they felt they could truly rely on when everything else was disintegrating. And that was exactly where Alistair wanted to be. But Alistair's grip on the investigation was absolute. He meticulously controlled the narrative, steering deputies and volunteers toward dead ends. He subtly introduced the idea that Lydia might have left Aethelburg on her own, perhaps overwhelmed by the pressures of her career aspirations. He floated the theory that she might be staying with a distant friend who hadn't come forward yet, or even that she might have been picked up by someone she knew and trusted. His carefully constructed theories planted seeds of doubt, diverting the search toward meaningless trails that led nowhere. Alistair knew precisely how to manipulate the emotions of those around him, perfectly playing the role of the devoted chief inspector while subtly pushing the investigation further from the truth. Every time the search teams came close to an area he feared they might examine, Alistair conveniently found a new lead, a possible sighting that required immediate investigation miles away, or a tip that needed instant attention elsewhere. He kept everyone in perpetual motion, always one step behind where they needed to be, ensuring no one ever got close to the grave where Lydia's body rested. Meanwhile, Lydia's parents desperately clung to Alistair's every word, believing he was exhaustively searching for their daughter. Marcus, in particular, relied on Alistair more than anyone. As both a father and an officer, Marcus felt utterly helpless in the face of his daughter's disappearance. But with Alistair leading the charge, he felt a spark of hope, a profound belief that if anyone could bring Lydia back, it was the man he had trusted for so many years. Alistair knew exactly how to leverage that trust, using it to keep Marcus close while simultaneously keeping the truth at bay. He made sure to involve Marcus in every phase of the investigation, giving him just enough responsibility to feel engaged, but never enough to uncover the awful truth. And when Marcus's frustration and grief boiled over, Alistair was there to absorb it, to allow him to vent his anguish without arousing any suspicion. "I should have been there," Marcus said repeatedly, guilt and grief thick in his voice. "I should have protected her." Alistair would shake his head, his expression solemn. "This isn't your fault, Marcus. We'll find her. I promise you, we will find her." It was the ultimate manipulation, a delicate balancing act of comfort and control, of empathy and monstrous deceit. Alistair provided the Vances with just enough hope to keep them functional, just enough assurance to prevent them from looking too closely at the gaping holes in the investigation. Days bled into weeks, and still, there was no sign of Lydia. The community grew agitated, rumors spreading like wildfire, theories whispered in hushed tones. Some believed she had run away, others feared the worst. But through it all, Alistair remained a steady, reassuring presence, the man everyone looked to for answers. Behind the scenes, however, the weight of his actions was beginning to take its toll. Each day the investigation dragged on was a chilling reminder of the terrible secret he was guarding. Though he wore the mask of the devoted chief inspector well, there were moments when the cracks began to show. Moments when the guilt gnawed at the edges of his mind, threatening to tear apart the meticulously constructed lie he had built. But Alistair couldn't afford to falter. The instant he slipped, the moment he dropped his guard, everything would come crashing down. So he kept moving, kept directing the search, kept feeding Marcus and Victoria just enough hope to keep them from giving up. He knew that time was his ally. The longer the search continued without results, the more people would come to believe that Lydia was lost forever. And if the investigation stretched long enough, it would eventually fade into the background, just another unsolved case, another tragedy without answers. That was the hope Alistair clung to, that the search would simply fizzle out, that the city would move on, and that his secret would remain buried where no one would ever find it. But secrets possess an undeniable impulse to rise to the surface, no matter how profoundly they are buried. As the days passed, the pressure on Alistair grew heavier, the cracks in his carefully controlled world spreading wider with each passing moment. The investigation he had worked so hard to dominate was slipping further from his grasp, and the harder he tried to contain it, the more fragile it became. For now, Alistair remained in control, barely. He kept the search alive, just enough to maintain appearances, kept Marcus close enough to prevent him from seeking answers elsewhere, and kept the truth entombed beneath layers of deception and false leads. But deep down, Alistair knew this fragile charade couldn't last indefinitely. The truth was out there, waiting to be discovered. And when it finally came to light, it would tear through everything in its path. Time has a way of dulling memories and softening the sharp edges of grief, but not for everyone. 5 months after Lydia's disappearance, the city of Aethelburg had begun to settle back into its routine, as people do after a communal tragedy. Life continued, though her absence lingered in quiet moments, and her name remained on the lips of those who still held onto hope. But as the months stretched into half a year, even hope began to wane. It was becoming another cold case, one of those lingering, unsolved tragedies that leave behind more questions than answers. The search parties had dwindled, the posters plastered on storefronts had begun to curl, and the once constant buzz of speculation had quieted to murmurs. It seemed, at least to some, that Lydia had simply vanished without a trace. Alistair Finch believed that, with enough time, the truth would remain buried, just like Lydia. But then, as so often happens in these dark narratives, the truth began its slow, inevitable climb to the surface, unexpectedly, and from the most unlikely source. The truth doesn't stay buried forever, no matter how deeply someone tries to hide it. It wasn't seasoned detectives or skilled hackers who uncovered the first cracks in Chief Inspector Alistair Finch's web of lies. It was 2 ordinary wildlife enthusiasts out for what should have been a peaceful day of photography in the New Forest. They had no idea that what lay ahead would unravel a mystery that had tormented Aethelburg for months. The 2 hikers, a couple in their late 20s, had ventured deep into a forested region rarely visited by anyone outside of dedicated naturalists. The path was rough and poorly defined, winding through dense woods where only silence reigned, broken solely by the occasional rustle of leaves. It was the kind of place where one would expect to find only nature, and certainly not a hidden secret. As the afternoon sun dropped lower, casting long dramatic shadows along the trail, they noticed something strange, an unnatural disturbance in the ground just off the path. A patch of earth, uneven and noticeably sunken, stood out starkly from the rest of the forest floor. The hikers exchanged nervous glances. It could have been nothing, a buried animal perhaps, but something about it felt terribly wrong. Their curiosity overcame their caution. Taking hesitant steps, they approached the disturbed ground. As one of them knelt down to inspect it more closely, they noticed a chilling detail, what looked like a corner of fabric, barely visible beneath the dirt and pine needles. It was a small thing, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down their spines. They knew better than to disturb the site any further. Instead, they marked the location precisely with their GPS and quickly retreated to the nearest ranger outpost, their hearts pounding with a terrifying mixture of disbelief and fear. The rangers, alerted by the hikers' discovery, immediately contacted local law enforcement. Within hours, a full investigative team was on site. What they discovered beneath the disturbed earth confirmed the hikers' worst fears. Lydia Vance's body, meticulously wrapped in a piece of material, lay in a shallow grave. Her remains told a silent, heartbreaking story of betrayal and violence. But the discovery didn't just reveal the location of her body, it posed more questions than it answered. How had Lydia ended up here, in this remote location? And, more critically, who had buried her there? As the forensic team worked methodically at the scene, uniformed officers scoured the surrounding area for any clues. And it was there, among the dirt and fallen foliage, that they found the first piece of undeniable evidence. A small, empty vial, half buried in the earth, bearing the faint impression of a fingerprint. It was a clue seemingly insignificant at first glance, but one that would later prove absolutely vital to the investigation. With Lydia's body recovered, the case that had gone cold suddenly reignited. Detectives took over the investigation, determined to piece together the truth behind her murder. They meticulously combed through GPS data from Lydia's phone, tracing her movements from the night she vanished. And what they found began to unravel the complex web of lies Alistair had spun. The data showed a profoundly troubling pattern. Lydia's phone had pinged from several locations far removed from where Alistair had claimed she was last seen. Among them was a remote petrol station just outside the city, a seemingly unremarkable stop that would become a critical piece of evidence. When the detectives obtained the surveillance footage from the petrol station, the full scope of Alistair's deception came into terrifying focus. The grainy video, recorded on the same night Lydia disappeared, showed Alistair's official vehicle pulling into the parking area. His expression was tight, his eyes darting around the area as if checking for any unwanted observers. And in the passenger seat, slumped and unmoving, was Lydia, her head resting against the window, her body limp. Alistair stepped out of the vehicle and looked around the lot. He went inside briefly, emerging moments later, casting another quick glance toward Lydia's unconscious form before getting back into the driver's seat. With a final, swift check over his shoulder, Alistair drove off into the night, the vehicle disappearing from the frame and, until now, from the city's collective memory. The video was damning, not just because it placed Alistair with Lydia on the night she vanished, but because of her vulnerable state, unconscious, alone, and in the company of the very man sworn to protect her. The footage raised immediate, terrifying questions. Why had Alistair never mentioned being with Lydia that night? Why had he completely failed to report their encounter in his official statements? And what, precisely, had happened after they left the petrol station? With Lydia's movements traced to the burial site, and the surveillance footage tying Alistair to her final hours, the detectives knew they were closing in. But they required more than mere suspicion. They needed hard evidence. And the key to unlocking that evidence lay in the digital breadcrumbs Lydia's phone had left behind. The GPS logs from Alistair's official car, pulled from its onboard tracking systems, provided the final, conclusive piece of the puzzle. The logs confirmed what the surveillance footage had horrifyingly suggested. Alistair's vehicle had traveled directly from the petrol station to the remote clearing where Lydia's body was found, matching the exact location marked by the hikers. Every stop, every turn was accounted for, painting a chilling, undeniable picture of premeditation and an elaborate cover-up. It was a trail Alistair had never expected anyone to find. But no matter how meticulously he had tried to conceal his actions, the truth had found a way to the surface. First through the sharp eyes of the hikers on the forest trail, and then through the relentless work of detectives determined to uncover the lies hidden beneath the facade of authority. The discovery of Lydia's body was not just the end of a search, it was the beginning of justice. And the hikers, completely unaware of the storm their quiet walk in the woods would unleash, had unknowingly uncovered the secret Alistair Finch had buried, both literally and figuratively. As the investigation surged forward, the truth about Alistair's monstrous betrayal spread through Aethelburg like a flash fire. His carefully crafted facade of authority crumbled beneath the overwhelming weight of the evidence. With each new discovery, the community began to grasp the true depth of his deception and the ultimate price Lydia had paid for his vile abuse of power. The hikers' discovery on that remote trail would become the inflection point in a cold case that had persisted for far too long. And as the city braced itself for the storm that was about to follow, one thing was certain: no secret, no matter how deeply buried, can remain hidden forever. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the quiet office as they locked around his wrists, cold steel biting into his skin. Alistair said nothing, the fight entirely drained from him as the devastating weight of his actions settled like a millstone in his chest. There was no more running, no more lying. The truth had found him, and there was nowhere left to hide. The National Crime Agency, NCA agents guided him out of the office, past the constables who had once saluted him, past the desks where he had issued commands. Now, they looked at him not as their chief inspector, but as the man who had betrayed every tenet of the badge. Whispers trailed him down the hall, the sound of their judgment heavy on his shoulders. As the agents escorted Alistair to the waiting unmarked car, the sun shone harshly, illuminating the day of reckoning. The truth, once buried beneath manipulation and lies, had finally clawed its way to the surface, and with it, Alistair Finch's life as he knew it was utterly over. The man who had spent his life serving justice was now bound by the very system he had once controlled, a prisoner of his own devastating sins. As the car doors slammed shut, The message resonated with absolute clarity. No one, not even the chief inspector, is above the law. Grief alone is unbearable, but discovering the full, horrific extent of a tragedy introduces a pain few can imagine. When detectives recovered Lydia Vance's body, the family nightmare deepened with every single revelation that followed. It wasn't just the betrayal of trust, the horrific murder, or the loss of a young life. The autopsy revealed a final, devastating truth that shattered what little remained of her family's world. The forensic team confirmed that Lydia had been in the early stages of pregnancy. The child she carried, Alistair Finch's child, had been growing inside her when her life was violently extinguished. That discovery transformed the grief of her parents, Marcus and Victoria Vance, into something beyond comprehension. They weren't just mourning their daughter, they were mourning the grandchild they would never meet. It was a loss layered with betrayal, violation, and the death of unspoken dreams. Marcus could barely process the news. His hands shook violently when the detectives informed him of the pregnancy. It was too much to bear. The knowledge that his own daughter had carried a child, only to be silenced by a man he trusted implicitly, a man who had sat at his kitchen table and offered him comfort as they searched for her. The sheer weight of that betrayal suffocated Marcus with a guilt he couldn't shake. How had he missed the obvious signs? How could he have stood side by side with Alistair, searching for his daughter, while the man responsible led them deliberately astray? And the pregnancy, he hadn't even known she was seriously dating, let alone involved with a man like Alistair. The betrayal came at him in relentless layers, peeling back everything he thought he knew, leaving him raw and utterly exposed. Victoria Ellis, already buried under the weight of her grief, fell into total despair when the autopsy results were revealed. The child would have been her first grandchild, a reason for hope, a new beginning. And now, both Lydia and the unborn child were gone, buried together under a blanket of lies and deception. There were no words that could possibly ease the pain of such a catastrophic, dual loss. Every dream Victoria had held for her daughter's future was gone, wiped away in the cruelest, most heartless act imaginable. News of Lydia's pregnancy spread rapidly, turning an already horrific crime into something even more unimaginable. Alistair Finch wasn't just a murderer, he was a predator who had leveraged his position of power, manipulated a young woman, and taken 2 lives to protect his own skin. The man who had once been the community's pillar of security now stood as a symbol of everything they despised. Protesters gathered outside the police headquarters and the courthouse, their voices roaring through the streets. Signs demanding justice for Lydia and baby waved frantically in the air, and the calls for Alistair's conviction grew louder by the hour. The community, once fiercely proud of its chief inspector, now viewed him as a monster in uniform. Every kind gesture, every award he had ever received felt like a mockery of the evil he had hidden behind his badge. In the Finch household, the revelations were equally devastating. Eleanor Finch sat in stunned silence as the news unfolded, her world collapsing under the crushing weight of her husband's lies. She had been blindsided by the affair, shattered by the murder, but the pregnancy, that was the final, fatal blow, the one truth she couldn't possibly comprehend. She recalled every moment she had shared with Alistair, every day he had spent with their daughters, knowing now that he had been harboring this unspeakable secret the entire time. It wasn't merely the betrayal, it was the knowledge that her husband had fathered a child with Lydia, a girl they had watched grow up, a best friend to their own daughter. The sheer malevolence of it all left her speechless. Seraphina Finch, Alistair's youngest daughter and Lydia's best friend, was utterly broken by the news. She had spent weeks mourning Lydia, trying desperately to understand how her father could be involved in such a crime. But learning about the pregnancy was too much to bear. Lydia had been carrying her half-sibling, and now both were gone, taken by the man she once called Dad. It was a betrayal so profound that Seraphina had no framework to process it. Seraphina withdrew completely, shutting out the world. She refused to speak to her father, wouldn't even acknowledge his existence. The very idea of him sickened her. Every shared memory, the moments she once cherished, were now tainted by the knowledge of his crime. She felt as though her entire life had been constructed on a foundation of lies, and the weight of that realization crushed her spirit. Harriet, Alistair's older daughter, reacted with raw fury. She had always felt a close bond with her father, had looked up to him as a role model, only to discover he had committed unspeakable acts against someone she had grown up with. The pregnancy was the final catalyst. Harriet packed her belongings and left the house, cutting all ties with her father, utterly unable to forgive him for the lives he had senselessly destroyed. The Finch home, once a beacon of laughter and stability, became a silent battleground. Eleanor tried desperately to keep her daughters together, but there was no repairing the damage Alistair had inflicted. Their family was fractured beyond repair, broken by the overwhelming weight of his betrayal. In the quiet, late-night moments, Eleanor sat alone, grappling with the unthinkable reality that the man she had loved for decades was capable of such monstrous acts. The community's anger burned hotter with every passing day. Lydia had been one of their own, bright, ambitious, full of potential. And now, both she and her unborn child were gone, victims of a man they had placed their absolute trust in. The demand for justice was relentless. They wanted to see Alistair punished, not just for Lydia's death, but for the life of the child she carried. They wanted to ensure he could never harm another soul. Marcus and Victoria found some measure of solace in the community's passionate support, but it was a cold comfort. The loss of their daughter and grandchild left a void that could never be filled. They attended every court hearing, sitting in the front row, resolute in their determination to see Alistair face the full, uncompromising weight of justice. But even a conviction couldn't bring Lydia back. Even seeing Alistair in handcuffs wouldn't heal the devastating wounds left behind. The tragedy that began with Alistair's vile manipulation had mushroomed into something far larger, a story of monumental betrayal, devastating loss, and utterly shattered trust. The community would never forget what had transpired, and neither would the families involved. The name Alistair Finch would forever be associated with pain, with loss, with the lives he had ruined to protect his own self-serving secrets. And as the trial loomed, the city braced itself for the final, difficult chapter, a reckoning long overdue for Lydia, for her child, and for everyone whose lives had been irrevocably shattered by the man they once called Chief Inspector. The trial of Alistair Finch seized the attention of Aethelburg and the entire nation, drawing everyone into the dark narrative of betrayal, manipulation, and murder. Reporters packed the courtroom, cameras positioned outside like vultures, ready to capture every detail of the chief inspector's fall from grace. It was more than just a trial. It was a reckoning, one that demanded every ugly truth be exposed for the world to see. From the very beginning, the prosecution moved swiftly, laying out their case and presenting a narrative of manipulation that laid bare Alistair's true character, a man who had exploited his authority and preyed on someone who trusted him absolutely. Every single move he made, they argued, was calculated, from the start of the affair to the cold-blooded murder that followed. Alistair Finch, they declared, was not the man the community believed him to be. He was a man who used his badge as a shield to conceal his darkest impulses. Piece by piece, the prosecutors meticulously reconstructed the events leading up to Lydia's death, utilizing surveillance footage, phone records, and forensic evidence to paint an undeniable picture of guilt. They exposed Alistair's efforts to manipulate Lydia, convincing her to meet him under the false pretense of mentorship. They detailed how he lured her to the remote cottage, drugged her, and ultimately killed her simply to safeguard his reputation and career. The courtroom was deathly silent as the prosecutors described Alistair's actions. Every word felt like a hammer blow to the foundations of trust. Each piece of evidence served as a stark reminder of the man Alistair had pretended to be and the monster he had become beneath the surface. Then came the emotional testimonies, and with them, the true heart of the trial was laid bare. Lydia's parents, Marcus and Victoria Vance, were the first to take the stand. There was no concealing the grief etched into their faces, nor the crushing weight of the pain they carried as they spoke about the daughter they had lost. Marcus's voice cracked as he recalled the first day Alistair had joined their desperate search for Lydia, standing beside him as a trusted friend. "He looked me in the eye," Marcus said, struggling to hold back tears. "He told me we'd find her, and the whole time he knew exactly where she was." His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands, the weight of the betrayal too much to bear. Victoria's testimony was equally devastating. She spoke about the bright dreams Lydia had for her future, the plans she had shared late at night over cups of tea. She wanted to make a difference, Victoria whispered, her voice trembling. She wanted to work for intelligence, to protect people. And instead, the man we trusted, our friend, stole her future and buried it in the ground. Her words hung in the air, infused with the profound sorrow of a mother who would never see her daughter grow into the woman she was meant to become. As the trial continued, the courtroom was filled with palpable tension. Every testimony, every exhibit presented, brought the harsh truth into sharper focus. But the most shocking testimonies came from Alistair's own family. Eleanor Finch, his wife, took the stand with a heavy heart, her voice steady but filled with utter disbelief. "I don't know who my husband is anymore," she confessed. "The man I married, the father of my children, wasn't capable of this. Or, at least, I thought he wasn't." She spoke about the months of lies, the late nights when Alistair returned home with excuses that now felt like deliberate insults. "I believed him," she said quietly. "I believed every single word. And now I have to live with the fact that I was married to a man I never truly knew." Her words landed with the weight of 1,000 betrayals, a wife forced to confront the darkest truth about the man she had shared her life with. Seraphina Finch, Alistair's youngest daughter, gave perhaps the most painful testimony of the entire trial. As she sat in the witness chair, tears streaming down her face, she spoke about the deep friendship she had shared with Lydia and the devastation she felt when the truth was revealed. "She was my best friend," Seraphina said, her voice trembling. "She was like a sister to me. And my father took her away from me." The room fell into profound silence as Seraphina's grief poured out, unfiltered and raw. The prosecution pressed further, painting a picture of a man who had not only betrayed his badge but had utterly destroyed 2 families in the process. They detailed the lengths Alistair went to in order to maintain control. His manipulation of Lydia, the lies he told his family, the complex web of deceit he spun around everyone who trusted him. Finally, it was Alistair's turn to face questioning. The room was still as he took the stand, the weight of his actions pressing down on him from all sides. He had initially denied the affair, denied everything, clinging to the desperate hope that he could somehow escape the consequences. But as the evidence relentlessly stacked up, it became clear there was no escape. Under the relentless questioning of the prosecutor, Alistair's defenses began to crumble. His mask of calm authority slipped away, revealing the man beneath, a man consumed by fear, regret, and consuming guilt. At first, his answers were clipped, short, as he attempted to maintain control. But the prosecutor's questions cut deeper, forcing him to confront the absolute reality of what he had done. "Did you have an affair with Lydia Vance?" the prosecutor asked, his voice steady and unyielding. Alistair hesitated, the weight of the truth suffocating him. He opened his mouth to deny it again, but the words wouldn't come. His shoulders sagged under the crushing burden, and for the first time, he spoke the truth. "Yes," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I did." The confession sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Alistair's family sat frozen in disbelief, while Lydia's parents clutched each other, their grief too overwhelming to contain. But the prosecutor was not finished. He pressed further, forcing Alistair to confront the full extent of his actions. "And did you kill her?" the prosecutor asked, leaning in closer. "Did you take her life to protect your secret?" Alistair's composure finally shattered. His hands trembled as he buried his face in them, the weight of his guilt too heavy to bear. "Yes," he choked out. "I killed her. I didn't know what else to do." His sobs filled the courtroom, the broken sound of a man utterly destroyed by his own sins. The room sat in stunned silence, the confession hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. There were no more lies to tell, no more masks to wear. Alistair Finch, once the respected chief inspector, had admitted to the unthinkable. The trial was far from over, but the truth had finally come to light. Alistair's confession marked the inevitable beginning of the end, an end that would bring a measure of justice for Lydia and her unborn child, and some semblance of closure to the families whose lives had been irrevocably shattered. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, one thing was certain: Alistair Finch's fate was sealed. There would be no escaping the consequences of his monstrous actions. The courtroom was silent, heavy with the immutable weight of justice about to be delivered. Alistair Finch stood shackled before the judge, his shoulders permanently slumped under the crushing burden of his actions. But no prison walls, no chains, could ever truly reflect the gravity of the lives lost at his hands. The life of Lydia Vance, the young woman he betrayed, and the unborn child she carried. This was not merely the sentencing of a man, it was the ultimate reckoning for 2 lives stolen too soon. The judge cleared his throat, his face solemn as he addressed the courtroom. His words carried the collective sorrow of the community, the profound devastation of 2 grieving families, and the indelible shame of betrayal from a man once entrusted with absolute power. There would be no easy way to deliver this sentence, for no words could ever fully capture the harm inflicted by Alistair Finch. "Mr. Finch," the judge began, his voice calm but firm, "you have not only committed a grievous crime, but you have also left behind irreparable damage to the lives of those you were sworn to protect. You betrayed a young woman who trusted you, exploited her vulnerability under the guise of mentorship, and in doing so, took advantage of your authority in the most despicable way imaginable." The courtroom remained still as the judge's gaze hardened. Lydia Vance was not merely a victim of your manipulation, she was a young woman with dreams, ambition, and a future ahead of her, a future that included the unborn child she carried. A child you helped create, and a child you silenced when you decided to take Lydia's life. Gasps rippled through the public gallery, the overwhelming weight of the revelation setting in once again. Lydia had carried within her not just the hopes of her parents, but the beginnings of a new, innocent life that would never see the light of day, all because of Alistair's desperate need to conceal his tracks. The judge paused, allowing the gravity of those words to fully sink in before continuing. "The child growing inside Lydia was your child, Mr. Finch. You knew the consequences of that revelation would utterly ruin your career, your reputation, and your family. And in a moment of utter selfishness and cowardice, you chose to end 2 lives to protect yourself. That choice reflects the profound depths of your betrayal, not just to Lydia, but to your own unborn child." Tears streamed down the faces of Marcus and Victoria Vance as the judge acknowledged their unimaginable loss. They were not only mourning their daughter but also the grandchild they would never meet. The double loss weighed heavily on them, and the judge's words only confirmed the hideous depth of Alistair's betrayal. Eleanor Finch clutched her hands tightly in her lap, as if the sheer force of her grip could keep her from fracturing completely. Alistair's daughters, Seraphina and Harriet, sat motionless, numb from the revelations that had violently torn their family apart. Lydia's unborn child would have been their half-sibling, a truth too painful for them to fully comprehend. The judge's voice remained steady, though his expression conveyed deep disappointment. "The badge you wore, Mr. Finch, was meant to serve as a symbol of integrity, responsibility, and protection. But you wielded it as a shield to hide your darkest intentions. You manipulated, you betrayed, and you destroyed. This court cannot undo the harm you've caused, nor can it restore the lives you took. But it can ensure that you never again harm another soul." The room held its breath as the judge delivered the sentence. "This court finds you guilty of first-degree murder, abuse of authority, and gross misconduct. In light of the severity of these crimes, and the fact that your actions resulted in the deaths of both Lydia Vance and your unborn child, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel struck with a sharp, final crack, the sound reverberating through the courtroom like a final judgment. There would be no reprieve, no chance for redemption. Alistair Finch's fate was sealed, and he would spend the remainder of his days in a prison cell, forever haunted by the lives he had senselessly taken. The gallery sat in shocked silence as the reality of the sentence was absorbed. Marcus and Victoria clung to each other, their grief too overwhelming for words. The child Lydia had carried, an innocent life caught in the crossfire of manipulation and betrayal, would never be known, never be given a name. And the knowledge of that loss, like a wound that would never fully heal, would remain with them for the rest of their lives. On the other side of the courtroom, Eleanor lowered her head, utterly unable to reconcile the man she had married with the monster now led away in chains. Her daughters, Seraphina and Harriet, sat frozen in their seats, their emotions swirling in a tempest of sorrow and confusion. The trial had revealed too much, truths they never wanted to know, burdens they never thought they would have to carry. As Alistair was escorted from the courtroom, the community watched in silent horror. They had placed their unwavering trust in him, and he had shattered it in the cruelest way possible. The sentence was justice, but it could never truly heal the scar left behind. Lydia and her child were gone, and no amount of justice could bring them back. The judge's final words lingered in the air as the courtroom emptied. Let this serve as a reminder that power is not a privilege, it is a responsibility. And when that responsibility is betrayed, there are consequences. No one is above the law, and no betrayal will go unanswered. The trial of Alistair Finch would be remembered not just as the story of one man's catastrophic fall from grace, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the absolute necessity of accountability. It was a searing reminder that authority means nothing without integrity, and that every betrayal, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually be exposed. And so, with Alistair's sentence to life without parole, the community was left to pick up the pieces. Justice had been served, but the devastating loss remained, a haunting reminder of the lives stolen too soon, and the trust that could never be restored. Even after the trial concluded and Alistair Finch was locked away, the devastating pain he caused lingered like a heavy shadow over the city. There were no simple answers, no quick resolutions. Lydia's death was not just a tragedy, it was a reckoning that forced everyone to confront the chilling reality of betrayal hidden behind power and trust. In the wake of such profound devastation, healing was slow and uneven. But it had to begin somewhere. For Marcus and Victoria Vance, the loss of their daughter was a wound that would never fully close. There were days when the grief felt unbearable, when the silence left behind by Lydia's absence was too deafening to ignore. But they resolutely refused to let her memory be defined solely by tragedy. Determined to create something meaningful from their pain, they founded the Lydia Vance Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting young women who had suffered abuse at the hands of those in positions of authority. The foundation quickly became a beacon of hope, providing legal assistance, counseling, and mentorship for survivors of exploitation. What started as a local initiative rapidly garnered national attention. The Vance family traveled the country, speaking at schools and community centers, determined to prevent other families from enduring the same nightmare they had suffered. For Marcus and Victoria, the foundation was a tangible way to honor their daughter's memory and to protect others from the insidious dangers she had faced. But healing manifested in many forms, and not all of it was public. Eleanor Finch and her daughters, Seraphina and Harriet, quietly packed their lives into boxes and left Aethelburg, hoping to escape the relentless scandal that had consumed their family. The weight of Alistair's betrayal was simply too great to bear in the city they once called home. Every street, every face, was a painful reminder of what had been lost. Eleanor chose a new town, far away from the screaming headlines, a place where she and her daughters could begin to rebuild. For Seraphina and Harriet, moving away offered a desperate chance at healing, but it also meant confronting the stark reality of who their father truly was. It would take years before they could fully process what had happened, before they could truly separate their cherished memories of the man they loved from the monster he became. Their journey toward recovery would be long and intensely complicated, but it was a necessary step they were prepared to take, together. Back in Aethelburg, the community struggled to rebuild trust. Confidence, once freely given, became harder to earn. The police department underwent a complete, thorough overhaul, with new leadership resolutely determined to restore the public's faith. Policies were rewritten, mandatory safeguards were put into place, and regular, rigorous training on ethics and accountability became standard practice. The city understood that it would take more than just new policies to rebuild trust, but they were committed to the effort. Local schools and community groups partnered with the Lydia Vance Foundation to create educational programs aimed at teaching young people about the dangers of manipulation and the abuse of power. Lydia's story became a permanent part of the city's identity, a difficult lesson learned the hardest way, but one they were determined not to forget. Her story was shared openly, not as a permanent scar, but as a reminder of the absolute importance of speaking up and of holding those in authority entirely accountable. There were still moments of anger, of deep frustration. The wound Alistair left behind would take years to heal, and some would never fully recover. But slowly, inch by painful inch, the community found ways to move forward. They knew that healing was not about forgetting, it was about remembering and learning, about becoming stronger and wiser through the pain. Even as the city began to rebuild, a question lingered, one that haunts every family, every officer, every person who followed the case. How do we protect ourselves from those sworn to protect us? Alistair Finch had worn a badge, had sworn an oath to serve and protect, yet he used that badge to manipulate, to betray, and to destroy. His story was not merely one of personal failure, it was a powerful warning, a reminder that power in the wrong hands is a deeply dangerous thing. The question now was not just about justice for Lydia, it was about preventing the next betrayal before it could ever take root. But this story is not the only one of its kind. There are others, other abuses of power, other betrayals hidden behind authority, waiting to be uncovered. Stories of manipulation, exploitation, and control that demand to be told. Stories that remind us why accountability matters, and why we must never stop questioning those who hold power. And so, we leave you with this final thought. What would your course of action be if the person meant to protect you became the one you feared most? How do we guard against those who hide behind a veneer of trust and authority? There are more stories to tell, more truths waiting to be revealed. Join us for the next chapter where we uncover another shocking case of abuse of power, one that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Please make sure you subscribe and stay tuned with us as we continue to expose the stories that demand justice and accountability, because the only way to prevent betrayal is to shine a light into the dark corners where it hides. This isn't the end. It's only the beginning.